women are always considered weak, vulnerable, not powerful. That is expressed, that is ensured, that is perpetuated through violence. And I think the two are not unconnected. So if women had greater power in society, if they were treated equally, I think a lot of the violence would dissipate. It's an expression of patriarchy. It's an expression of the perpetuation of inequality. And it's everywhere, and it's not getting better.
Welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber UK. I'm Frances Scott, founder and director of 50/50, and we're delighted this week to be interviewing Helen Pankhurst. The focus of this sandbox is to highlight gender inequality in public life and how we can move to better gender balance in parliaments, councils, and elected office throughout the UK. And I have to thank Helen for being such a great support for 50/50 from the very early days when I went along to a march in 2014, and she was kind enough to welcome us. So, and she's been involving 50/50 in the Centenary Action from those very early days. So thank you, Helen. We're going to speak about some of the ways that socioeconomic sectors can become more gender equal and the importance of having gender equal representation in the corridors of power. If you find these videos useful, you can visit Chamber UK to know more. So on to the first question. The broad scope of her work, with similarities and links that she's been able to draw between the suffragette movement, which was founded and headed by her great-grandmother, Emmeline Pankhurst, in the UK, and the international development of global feminism. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Frances, and thanks for this opportunity. I mean, it's interesting. You start with the suffragette movement and with Emmeline, who was the leader of the movement. I would very quickly bring in Sylvia, who was her middle daughter, who then went on to live in Ethiopia and was very much an international, what you would now call a global feminist. Which is not to say that the whole movement wasn't. I mean, if you think back to the links that they had from the UK to many countries around the world, that first wave of feminism was very much a global wave. So links then, in terms of that attention to politics and understanding that politics was about power, and that for any change, including change around gender issues, that was an obvious starting point. That is a global story. It continues to this day. So if we look at the international perspective, the issue of women and their position in politics and in power remains central to any campaign, any issues around social change. So if we're talking about global feminism, you can't almost immediately start talking about power and politics. That's one link, what we focus on. I think there are many others. So if you consider how the suffragettes campaigned, the fact that they focused on women's agency, their leadership, they explored what the role of men should be in this process, with a sense that traditionally women were subservient, they listened, they were quiet. Suddenly, with this change, it required of them to lead, to do all sorts of campaigning initiatives that they hadn't done in the past. But also, similarly, it required of men to be in a supportive role, not in that leadership role. And this they worked out, championed, had different views on. And I think that remains in the global feminist space and in the development space, that issue of who speaks and for whom and when, and how you all learn to navigate that in more equal ways, I think continues to be very relevant. When we think about the influence of the suffragettes right now, the link between how you campaign and how militant you become, how much you use force, what kind of force the government is using and what kind of force you as the social campaigners use, is very much top of, people think about that quite quickly. They associate suffragettes with militancy. And right now, the environmental movement is very much doing that. So I'm finding people asking me all sorts of questions about why, how much militant actions, meaning protest, meaning disruptive protest, is relevant in any campaigning initiatives. I mean, there's a lot more I could say. I could speak endlessly about this, but let me stop there just to say the what, the how, and for whom I think we can learn from and continue to resonate today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and the suffragettes and the suffragists were taking different views. And I mean, 50-50 Parliament is never going to be the kind of campaign that enters into violent protest, if that's a way you can put it. We're here to support women and a friendly network offering support. That's the approach we've chosen to take, and absolutely the environmentalists, Just Stop Oil, are the more extreme, whereas obviously the latest thing we've heard from Extinction Rebellion is that they're not going to take quite such a radical approach. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's really, really difficult because when you care passionately, when the rate of change is so slow, when the instruments of power can become more and more autocratic and reduce the space for dialogue and discussion, splinters of the groups will think differently. Also, if you take this to a global context where in some countries, just women speaking, just women being educated, just women wearing certain things are political, are militant, you understand how complicated that decision about how you campaign can be. And it's both an individual, how does an individual relate to it? It's a collective one as well. How does an organization such as 50-50 relate to all of that?
When people talk about gender equality, some say that the concerns of ethnic and racial inequality and other such intersectional identities can get sidelined. Obviously, we want to avoid that. Everyone is part of this movement and all different identities are important. How do you think we can ensure that everyone feels involved and no groups feel excluded or isolated from this conversation?
Yeah, it's absolutely central, pivotal. I can't think of how else to say how important this is, because what the feminist movement is, or when we're talking about women in politics, what we're saying is those who are excluded. If we then say it's only one group of those who are excluded and the others can remain excluded because of age, because of disability, because of ethnicity, because of religion, whatever reasons, then we are perpetuating the problem that we are there to solve. So I think when we're talking about inclusion, it has to be centered around ensuring all forms of inclusion. That's not to say we always achieve it. That's not to say it's always easy, but that has to be the aim, the objective. The methods that we use have to include that idea of a broader understanding of diversity, including the non-obvious forms of diversity. So, for example, when you're thinking about disability, there are hidden forms of disabilities, and we need to be able to bring everybody into the space, because from whatever background they come, if they can bring those to policy spaces, then they can affect change in those areas. Otherwise, there's a blindness to that aspect of people's experiences that will be perpetuated by policymakers and therefore in policy.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And we at 50-50 recognise that some women face higher hurdles and double discrimination. So obviously we're campaigning on behalf of all women, but there are some women who need even more encouragement, more support. And I know that we are all trying to address these issues jointly, and it's great to be working together on that. So would you like to elaborate a bit about the work that Centenary Action is doing to create a positive noise for women's rights in elected office? You know, you can elaborate on the broader initiatives of the work that you've been doing. And we'd love you to speak a little bit about the Women Count campaign, which is, I love what you've been doing over social media. Yes, in the context of elected office and representation, we'd love to hear more about all that.
Okay, so Centenary Action was formed just before 2018 being the centenary when the first women got the vote and were able to stand in Parliament. We set up then because there was a fair amount of celebration about this centenary. However, many of us felt that as well as a separate celebration, there was need to reflect on how much things had or hadn't changed since then, and that there was this opportunity to think about the period between 2018, that first centenary, and 2028, which is the centenary, will be the centenary of equal franchise, when women got the vote on the same grounds as men in terms of age, wealth, etc. So there are these 10 years between 2018 and 2028. And what we wanted to do is try and shift the needle in that period, try and raise as much awareness about the constraints to women in politics as we could in this period. Now, we're now halfway there, but there's still a way to go in so many ways. What I mean by we was a group that came together very consciously cross-party, and this was incredibly important to us because we want feminism never to be on the opposition, never to be in the backbenches. Feminism in Parliament needs to be everywhere. So having the cross-party engagement, including by the organisations like Women to Win and Labour Women's Network, etc., from all of the parties was important. But also we wanted to link with civil society, because civil society, the voters, strong democracy is all about their engagement. And there are a lot of organisations focused on women and their spaces and their interests within civil society that are not always well linked with the political establishment. So what we wanted was this group to link civil society, and that also means academics and business women, etc., and organizations representing them, with those involved in the political sphere to try and push for change. And we're very much a network. So as you've mentioned, 50/50 is involved, Elect Her, Fawcett Society, but also broader organizations like the Women's Institutes, the Girl Guiding, and then organizations such as Muslim Women's Network and other focused on particular interest groups. And so we've come together as a coalition to try and push for change. When we first started, we felt that there were three major constraints. One was around the structures and system of Parliament itself, and looking at which ones people were pushing for and we could add our voice to really try and result in change in those structures of Parliament. The second was around the economic constraints, because we see it all the time that women, because they are poorer, because they have less income and wealth statistically, because they have all sorts of commitments for cultural reasons, for social norm reasons around childcare, etc., their ability to economically engage in Parliament, which is an uncertain career, is harder. So looking at the economic constraints and seeing what those barriers were that we could address, why there were problems around the economic realities for women in politics. And then the third one was around violence, because again, all the statistics show us that women, particularly some women, that issue of double and triple discrimination that you were talking about earlier, women are more likely to be abused online, and there's this major concern and fear about their personal safety. So what Centenary Action set up to do was look at those three in collaboration with everybody else and see what we could shift. Now, moving on to the Women Count campaign, which is the campaign that we're involved in right now. And that is spotlighting the candidates and finding out where women are coming through the system. So it's looking at the pipeline. And just like the gender pay gap reporting, by enforcing reporting, by enforcing accountability and spotlighting the data, is beginning to shift and show where there are pay gaps. We feel that the Women Count campaign, by spotlighting and understanding what candidates, where we're getting a diversity of candidates coming through, will provide that accountability, which will force change. So working again cross-party, all the parties know that the issue of a better gender representation and diversity is incredibly important to their success. They all know this, but we want to hold them accountable to it. And so we are doing some of this data. Ideally, it shouldn't be us, a network that's doing this. This should be the responsibility of Parliament and of parties. And the way it could be done would be if the Section 106 of the Equality Act was passed, this section, the Section 106, would require all parties to provide the information about their candidates, who is standing. And if you think a bit of like a jigsaw puzzle of, if there's only ever been one color, i.e. men of a certain age who've only ever stood and been elected in that particular area, then we have this uniformity of a problem. If we can see and ensure that everywhere women can come through the systems, they are being put forward in all sorts of places, then things will change. So it's spotlighting, it's showing the data. We'll do a lot of analysis of the data, and it's also highlighting individual women in all their diversity, their stories, giving them a platform to show the variety of ways for women to become candidates and therefore to be part of our democracy.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, obviously, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it strikes me as very weird. We talk about democracy, and yet most people, because women actually are most people, 52% of the population are not properly represented, or even, properly involved. And I think there's a major concern if women aren't interested or say that they don't wish to participate, or if it's inaccessible, then we have a problem. It needs to be accessible, and everybody needs to be wanting to participate. There has to be a general willingness, and people who are involved need respect and protection. So I completely agree. I also completely agree that actually there needs to be more openness. We need to know, in particular, the candidacies and the opportunities that are available should be well publicized with an open application process.
Yeah. Yes,
everything.
It's often the selectorate that's the problem. This is one of the things that we're seeing. So, it's once the data is there, we can see what the problem is and ensure that there is change. But
yeah, absolutely. The whole selection process is so opaque, and the people who have the power are the selection committees, and who they choose for winnable seats. So it's great that you're doing this work, and it's wonderful that, to be involved and see it going on. And thank you very much indeed. So drawing on the pages of Deeds Not Words, your great book, it seems that we've come a long way, but there's still lots more that needs to be done. Through a historical lens, how would you say that we've fared in achieving gender equality in elected office? And what interventions can be brought in today that can help facilitate the process, do you think?
So, in terms of how far we've got, the data, purely numeric data, is showing us that there's still so much to be done. So what is it? 35% of the MPs are women. I think it's about 30% of the cabinet. It's 29, I think, in the House of Lords. We still have male hereditary peers, male-only hereditary peers. So the system in Parliament, mirrored in the devolved assemblies, although slightly better in the newer establishments, the less rigid newer establishments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland.
Absolutely.
In terms of councils, still very much a problem. We have, I think, roughly 1/3 of local councillors are women. And then if you look at the leadership, the figure I saw was 95% of local authorities are dominated by men. So there is still numerically a way to go. If we then look at the impact of that in terms of how women feel in those spaces and what policies they can prioritize and enact, whose interests, whose voice, whose priorities come through, they are related to representation. So I think there's an incredible amount that still needs to be done. In terms of how we do that, the first point that I mentioned was that of Section 106 of the Equality Act, we're nearly there. We really just need one party to agree to do that. And then if we have all of the parties showing that data, then we will get better representation. And that is part of the story. I think there are all sorts of things that might seem small, but are really important. So, for example, there was access to elected office fund for disabled women in Parliament. It was available, and then it hasn't been, and it's important that that gets reinstated, because that's that small thing, fund to support disabled people in positions so that they can affect change, so that they can be at the policy table, is really, really important. I think that there's so many things around. If we had a representative parliament, they would be pushing with all sorts of things. And we've seen that in terms of some of the changes. So if you look at some of the work that Stella Creasy and others have been making around the issues about the maternity positions for women, that shows how they are seeing certain problems and changing it. The issue of Parliament being in one location and people's homes being elsewhere is really difficult for families, not just for women, not just for mothers, but for families. And there are ways in which the timings of when Parliament sits that could change. It has changed a bit, but it could still change a lot, so that MPs could work more in their constituencies, and there could be certain times when they're in Parliament which are more constrained and which would allow for that family life to be more effective for everybody, etc., etc. There's so many changes, small and major, but what it requires is the will and the commitment and the prioritization. And we really, really need to see that happen. And we would like to see that happen before 2028, because this is our patch and we need to see it now, so that by 2028, i.e. 2 elections from now, we can have that gender parity and therefore policies that reflect the needs of the whole of society.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, obviously. And I remember in 2018, you were talking about a decade of democracy. Yes, and here we are halfway through it. And to your point about changes, I mean, COVID ensured that changes happened. Technology exists. You know, here we are Zooming each other. And it was possible for Parliament to continue, even though people had to stay separate. And this was actually very beneficial. I remember Wendy Chamberlain, who is an MP from Scotland, saying how useful it was for her. As you say, she could stay in her constituency, but she could still represent her constituents in Westminster using technology. And it's kind of a shame, really, that this opportunity hasn't been grasped more, in my opinion. It is something that would actually make the corridors of power more accessible to people who do have family or caring commitments. You could also argue that, in fact, it would lead to better representation, in that you'd be in your constituency and be able to respond to, you know, local matters more quickly. But anyway, absolutely, we really do need to try and ensure that those who have the power grasp the potential that is available. But the violence against women is a major problem, and obviously something that deters women from putting their head above the parapet. They're concerned not only about themselves, but their families. What protective measures do you think we need to put in place, or are already in place? I mean, Sir Lindsay Hoyle very kindly came and spoke at the last event 50/50 held in Parliament, and he said he was putting in better security. What do you think might help in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of violence is the flip of the coin of power, isn't it? You know, if women are always considered weak, vulnerable, not powerful, that is expressed, that is ensured, that is perpetuated through violence. And I think the two are not unconnected. So if women had greater power in society, if they were treated equally, I think a lot of the violence would dissipate. It's an expression of patriarchy. It's an expression of the perpetuation of inequality. And it's everywhere, and it's not getting better. So you mentioned my book, Deeds Not Words, which I published in 2018. And since then, I've been doing a lot of talks up and down the country. And in that book, I ask people to rate or to rank how far they think we've got in terms of economics, in terms of politics, and in terms of violence and others. And, I asked them to rate between 0 and 5. And the lowest score always is for how far we've got in terms of addressing violence for women. I mean, literally, people are voting 0 or minus sometimes, or 1 out of 5 in ways that they're going 2, 3 or something like that when it comes to politics. So it is there. It's a situation where every single girl and woman in this country and in most countries around the world have some kind of curfew, some kind of internal questioning about where they're going, when they're going, because of gender-based violence. I'm not saying men are not exposed to violence, they are, but not gender-based violence, and not in this systemic way. So not surprising then that Parliament, a place of power, perpetuates these inequalities around the expression of power through violence, nor that those who are aggrieved by politicians also express their need to exert their male power against women MPs and women in positions of authority. So much more needs to be done. It's really not shifting at all. And I think that all the policies in the world that are needed, policies are needed. So the on-harm bill, for example, is going to be a change in that respect. But it's also about culture, about ideas around equality. It's about norms. It's about tackling those attitudes. And it's about the individual responsibility of everybody, including of bystanders, to uphold a different culture and a different idea about the relationship between men and women.
Yeah, completely agree. It's about respect as well, isn't it? And the nature of our politics has become so confrontational, whereas actually my impression is that MPs do actually work together to get policy through, and a more collaborative approach and a respectful approach, even if we share different opinions about the methods. Yes.
Yeah. And Frances, that's really, really important, that most people in Parliament and most people in the world behave well. But there is this expression, one bad apple. One bad apple contaminates all apples, physically, in reality, with apples. Have you ever had a bad apple in amongst other? What happens is other apples. By the way, that's an expression, and that's a piece of work that links to some of the wonderful work that Laura Bates has done.
Right.
In her book that I read recently. And I think she's spot on in the idea that everything else can be fine. But if you allow some of these expressions, if you allow a few people, and if you don't have systems of accountability and calling out and ways of addressing where it fails, then the whole thing shifts. And because of the traditional cultures that have allowed this inequality, because it's age-old, century-old views that perpetuate it, the amount of work you need to do to make sure that when you see a bad apple, you move that bad apple out and the rest of society is not contaminated.
Well, I think the problem we face is that social media amplifies these things, like Andrew Tate, etc., and they become influencers, and this is very dangerous. Absolutely. So I think this is where networks are so important, like yours and ours, and we try to give personal support via our WhatsApp groups and in our bite-sized meetings where women can speak to each other and actually, as you say, recognize, although there might be 1 or 2 people out there that are causing massive problems and repeatedly, in fact, most people are very reasonable. And the feedback that we've had from local elections, for example, is that in fact, the female candidates that were running in the latest local elections, many of them had good experiences on the doorstep doorstep, even if they've met people who didn't share the same political persuasion. People are polite and say so, and you move on quickly in order to try and meet someone else who could be persuaded. And that the dialogue is pleasant and respectful. And I think it is really important that we hang on to this, and ensure that anyone who is progressing in public office or might be interested understands that there are mechanisms in place to support you, and that it's only one or two detractors or one or two people who might have big voices amplified via the social media, but actually in reality most people are reasonable and pleasant to deal with.
I think that's right, but I also think there are ways of speaking and ways of campaigning and ways in which politics happen that can be more collaborative and that can be more confrontational. And I think historically they've been more confrontational, and that comes with a male lens and male tradition. I don't want to essentialize, and it's much more complicated than that, obviously. Yes. But women do come to things more collaboratively, generally, and that is needed more and more in political spaces. It's needed to affect change effectively. You know, when you have the different voices and you can find common ground, that tends to result in changes more effectively. And I think that this is gendered to some extent, not simplistically, but it is gendered. So another reason why we need more women in Parliament is because it can change the mood, the methods of engagement. And some of the best parts of Parliament, I hear from both within and outside, is the cross-party committee work, when there
Absolutely.
are better forms of communication. So one of the other reasons why we need more women in Parliament is because they will transform Parliament to be more collaborative.
Yes, hear to that. Could not agree more. So how do you hope that policy making and democracy will change when we have 50-50 representation? You've already referred to the idea that it would be more collaborative and therefore more effective. What other sort of benefits do you think a 50-50 Parliament might have?
Let me start with the most fundamental one, which is that if any person, any child in particular, closed their eyes and was asked to envisage what a politician looks like, if they described the diversity of our society, they then would see politics reflected in them and vice versa. And then you have a thriving democracy, only then. Because if you have parts of society that do not feel represented, then they are excluded from society. There's a direct, obvious link. And I also think that it's therefore foundational. Whatever, if you create that foundation, which is strong and representative, then anything that you build from that is that much stronger. And let me give one example of why that's stronger. If you look purely at the gender, so without an intersectional lens, purely at a gender perspective on this, we know that women are more aware of the issues of the caring economy and the fact that every single person in their life cycle is involved around needing care at the beginning, often around health issues in the middle and at the end. So there is a care need for every single citizen, every single individual. And yet policy and politicians tend to, and often men tend to put work on one space and care in another. It's a domestic thing. It's not monetized. It's not valued. And although some systems are beginning to look at that differently, so, you know, not coincidentally, by the way, the Ministry of Health, the first time that was set up was in 1919, i.e. just after women become citizens and become,
right.
So, you know, there is understanding of the importance of care, but in terms of care meaning health-related care and the NHS and the whole social care and all of that. But we know how dysfunctional all of that is. We know how parents talk about the difficulties of making ends meet because of the whole economics of the childcare, et cetera, et cetera. If you had a parliament that really understood the links between care and work and that were premised on that understanding of their link, would we not have a more effective parliament? Would we not have a more effective society?
Yeah, well, look, I'm here to all that. I can, again, I'm just sitting here nodding in agreement to all your answers, which is wonderful. And this is kind of where I come from. I think that the life that women lead, which has, the roles have been fairly gendered historically. Women provide the care, and women's life and experience is just as important as men's lives, and corporate world is as important as the caring world, and the caring world is as important as the corporate world, and that really we need the experience of people participating in both to formulate policy and build a better society, which is why I think women's participation in politics and the corridors of power is so crucial. And it is interesting, in Scandinavia, where there are more gender balanced parliaments, this has an impact on parenting policy. And men participate more in parenting, and it allows women to participate more in public life. And this has enhanced family relationships, and which is one of the bedrocks of society. But so I'm so in agreement with pretty much everything that you've said, Helen.
Yeah.
It is such a pleasure to have you. Is there anything more that you'd like to add?
Just to make sure that people vote and make sure people care and do the best that they can, and do follow Centenary Action. There's a lot going on and we need your help.
Yeah, well, look, massive thanks for joining us today. And thank you for all the support that you've given 50/50 in the past, and the continued support that you give us. And we're so honoured that you're going to join us on the 17th of July in Parliament to celebrate Emmeline's birthday. And we will be obviously circulating more information about that and the link to join. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you.